But first, let's turn to a primary passage. It's not the only passage we're going to look at in the study, but one of the primary passages that I'll probably reference over and over again, besides the fact that this is a study on Matthew 9:14 through 17, but one of the passages that I'm going to make use of a lot is out of the book of Romans, where, let's just read it here. Paul says, starting in verse 25, "For I do not want you, brethren, to be uninformed of this mystery." We have to stop right away and ask, who are the you brethren that he's addressing when he says, I don't want you to be uninformed? Obviously, he's talking to the church there at Rome, and we learned this in our Roman study, that the word brethren, the Greek word adelphoi or adelphos or some form of adelphos or adelphon or something, depending on which case we're looking at, plural or singular, in the apostolic scriptures, more often than not refers to brother Christians, both Jews and Gentiles, from representatives from both sides of that part of the community. Brothers, I don't want you to be uninformed of this mystery. However, within the context, he's really addressing Gentile believers, because he's in this nuanced conversation. We're breaking into context, but he's in the middle of this conversation of explaining how that the Gentile wild olive tree has been grafted into this family of Abraham, we could say Jewish family, cultivated olive tree, and thus forming this one new humanity known as the remnant of Israel. New in regards of the aspect of there's a larger Gentile element than there was prior. Not new in the sense that there's always been a remnant, like Isaiah says. God has always preserved a remnant, so that part's not new. But when we talk about the one new man in Ephesians, kind of overlapping Romans with Ephesians here, then Paul's simply trying to get us to understand that after Acts chapter 2 and the work of the Holy Spirit, there's this element of the gospel that's not been properly understood by Israel, and it's the bringing in of the Gentiles. So that's the context that Paul wants the brethren to understand, the mystery. And this mystery is that Gentiles are being brought into the family of Abraham without having to change their ethnicity and to change their family association. They don't have to undergo any conversion rites and switching around of who's your papa, who's your daddy. So that's why it was a mystery. Israel didn't see it. They were blinded to it. God was, of course, aware of what was happening because he planned it from the beginning. So this is this mystery that Paul's talking about, the mystery of the gospel. And again, read Romans 11, chapter 11, with Ephesians, really the whole book of Ephesians in mind, particularly chapters 2 through 5, I would say. That's my recommendation. Go back and do that as your homework assignment. So he says to the Romans here, lest you be wise in your own estimation, that a partial hardening has happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. Notice that the hardening is partial until Israel has and the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. Some versions kind of stress the idea that it's a partial hardening to a part of Israel. So if that's the case, then replacement theology cannot be factual in all of its implications. If the hardening is only partial, it's a partial hardening. And it's temporary, meaning only until the Gentiles have come in, which implies that once the fullness of the Gentiles has come in, that the partial hardening will be removed, or something to that effect. He goes on to say, Paul, and thus all Israel will be saved. And I take the all there not to be speaking of every single Israelite will be saved. Rather, it's likely it is simply the largest representation. Israel will be characterized by salvation. And then he goes on to quote, this is a quote from the Tanakh, just as it is written, quote, the deliverer will come from Zion. He will remove ungodliness from Jacob, speaking about, national cleansing and atonement on Israel's part, which would, of course, result in the blindness being removed and the reincorporating of her as a primary people group along with the Gentiles, so that Israel must now, I think, include the Gentiles, especially since this is a passage where the context has already been established that the wild olive tree has been grafted into. Thus, the term Israel gets broadened. It doesn't get replaced. So rather than saying that the Gentiles have replaced Israel or overtaken Israel, it's better to say that the Gentiles have become partakers rather than overtakers. That's the way I like to describe it. Partakers in the plans and the purposes and the promises and the blessings of God. And thus, the church gets to utilize and inherit the label Israel along with that family, clan, association without having to undergo any man-made conversion ritual to change their status from Gentile to Jew, which was the big hubbub in the first century, the big hurdle or hindrance or barrier to understanding and allowing the gospel to go forward from Israel to the rest of the nations. That man-made conversion policy, the works of the law, the whole covenantal nomism program. Go back and read the book of Galatians very carefully with that in mind, and things will make a lot more sense. So,